and welcome to The Hot Seat with Violet Gonda, the program that puts the newsmakers in the spotlight to deal with the tough issues relating to Zimbabwe. So who's in the hot seat this week?
Zimbabwe is on the brink of collapse. Running battles between anti-Mugabe protesters and riot police are becoming regular and violent, including an unprecedented war of words between ZANU-PF leaders and war veterans. My guest on the Hot Seat program this week is human rights activist and constitutional lawyer Brian Kagoro, who has always said ZANU-PF's biggest opposition is the economy. Now, given the fragile political landscape, how much time do we have as a country, and what is the way forward? Welcome on the program, Brian.
Thank you, Violet.
I'm sure you've seen that the mood in the country has totally changed over the last few weeks. Can you define where we are right now?
I think that I don't think this is the boiling point yet, but it's an uncertain moment. And that uncertain moment arises out of three quick things. Number one, that people have been suffering for quite a long time, and the economy has been on life support for much longer. And number two, the ruling party, which has kept a false unity based on its vilification of the opposition and also this notion of sanctions by the West. The chickens have finally come to roost within the ruling party because the veneer of unity has been wiped away, and the real power disputes are coming to the fore. And the third and last thing is actually, I think what's happened is that there's been an activation of a sector that for a long time had sublet its entitlement to the political parties, which is the citizen. And so this flag movement, Tajamuka and Co., indicates that you have a reactivation of citizens outside of political parties occupying space and contending for their rights.
So are you seeing any similarities between what's happening now and the historical struggles, especially the ones that you were involved with in the past?
Yes, I think this is essentially what happened in the late 1990s, and the context and circumstances were similar. We saw in the 1990s, because of the economic structural adjustment programs and the internal repression, that several things had happened. The cost of living had reached unsustainable levels. The state dealt with citizen discontent about poor service and rampant redundancies through force and violence. And the ruling party, which had factions emerging then, dealt with opposition through labeling. So what happened is labor organized itself, as did the students and the women's movement. And the coalescing or coming together of these entities led to what we saw in the 90s as the constitutional movement. And of course, predictably, the state responded first through violence and containment, and then second, when it realized that the tide couldn't be contained, through a form of accommodation by engaging in what they tried to do was to hijack the process by engaging in their own constitutional reform on their own terms. Of course, it led to the referendum, and the rest is history. When the state lost the referendum, its resort to violence was unprecedented in the history of independent Zimbabwe. So we saw from the 4th of March the death of Chiminya and others, and later on up to 2000 when we had that election, various deaths, executions, and post that date, abductions and human rights violations. So what we're seeing is the state doing what it knows best. When it cannot reason with its citizens, when it cannot engage in transformative reform, it employs violence to silence.
But are there any differences, Brian?
There are differences, and I think the differences are interesting. The differences are this, that the military and the war veterans and the ZANU-PF youth always weighed in on the side of Robert Gabriel Mugabe, and there seemed to be a unity amongst the military bourgeoisie and the political bourgeoisie and the administrative bourgeoisie. We're seeing now what we're seeing a crack within the upper echelons of the civil service, those who have not been paid for a long time. We're seeing open dissent. Within the upper echelons of the coercive arms of state, the police, the intelligence, and the army, we're seeing open dissent. And within the war veterans, we are seeing it's no longer dissent. I think it's revolt. It's outright revolt, which even questions some of the collective lies that have been told over years about the history of the liberation struggle. And this component is so different that it risks undermining the pro-democracy component, because I think that the danger is that the pro-democracy forces, who for long have wanted the removal of Robert Mugabe, might mistake the discontented ZANU-PF elements as their genuine allies, and therefore cede space and hand over the business of doing transformation to these forces, which I don't think are transformative.
So what about this coalescing of opposition forces? Do you think that there is a struggle for transformation there, or it's a scramble for power? You've seen all these opposition political parties joining together. And also, you mentioned the Tajamuka and this flag movements. Are they real alternatives?
No. If you and ZANU-PF, you would be very happy with what Tajamuka and this flag are doing. And what they're doing, though important for citizen agency, direct agency, is good for ZANU-PF, because what it does, it takes away real support and citizen confidence from the organized political parties that contest for the conquest of political power. And we have less than 19 months to the next election in 2018. And so in essence, the more you have Tajamuka and this flag, and because these are not going to contest for political power, and the more citizens are aligned to this, I think that if you were the ruling party or the incumbent, you'd be happy to have the opposition not commandeering or commanding the collective support and trust of the masses. So that's one. But number two, when you bring together opposition political parties, you have to be careful that you are not simply bringing together opposition political parties, but you are bringing together a collective or a collection of strengths, not weaknesses. And at the moment, the articulation of what the developmental alternative is, or the economic alternative is, seems to me rather grossly diluted and weak. There's no consensus on economic matters. There's a consensus on the electoral.
So, and you mentioned the issue of the war veterans, in that they may not really be on the people's side, and that even if we have any change within ZANU-PF, it's not going to be transformative. Did I get you right? That will be change without transformation?
Yeah, you know what? The war veterans may very well be on some people's side. What I'm arguing is that they are not necessarily on the side of human rights, on the side of the sort of democracy that my generation and those that were in the late 90s into the 2000s were fighting for. So in essence, aligning with them means you have to negotiate away your struggle for accountability and end of impunity, because some of them were engaged in brutalizing our people and violating human rights. Some people who have formed part of this grand coalition of opposition parties were responsible for the abduction and assassination of some of my comrades. So the question that we have to answer is, do we ignore this and move forward? And how do we tell the children of Chiminya? How do we justify doing this? Do we use the exigencies of attaining political power? Do we use a broader normative framework? And my sense is I am very uncomfortable, because there is not a discussion in the formation of this coalition of what will happen to the historical accountability. And this history is not a long history. It's a very recent history.
So what do you think the opposition should do in this case?
I'm not sure why they thought they needed to bring the expelled ZANU components, as important as they are as citizens. I think that the opposition has always lacked self-confidence. In 2008, when I interviewed with you, I was clear that the opposition was going to do much better in the rural areas. It seemed that we're the ruling party that was not ready to lose or prepared to lose, and an opposition that wasn't prepared to win. We again find ourselves in this instance that the opposition is using traditional lens to view where citizen confidence is. Who they should be wooing now are those citizens in Tajamuka, in this flag movement, by offering clear alternatives, so that they're able to say, as those progressive components of the opposition movement, we're able to marshal sufficient support. We have assured our people that we have a people's manifesto that they can endorse and in which they will see themselves. We are offering them a truly alternative leadership, not just recycling our old core.
Are you surprised, though, that even though the ZANU-PF house is on fire, that there's all this infighting we're hearing about, that ZANU-PF still seems to be winning elections and even getting more new members, as we saw in the last by-election where ZANU-PF won with more than 12,000 votes. Wouldn't you think that, with the way people are so anti the ruling party, that not a lot of people will actually go and vote for this party?
I think that I have avoided over the years to engage in false analysis. There are some people who support ZANU-PF, and there are many. Whether they do it willingly or under coercion, there are many. I have suggested over the years that when you study the urban voter turnout, and in particular for the main opposition political party, we have seen a decline in that vote. If you look at the votes that David Coulthard, Welshman Ngube, Priscilla Misaira Mshonga, our brother in Mabuku, and so on and so forth, got in the first election in 2000, and progressively what they got in the following elections, that vote winning margin has declined. And this declined by a threshold of anything between 10 to 19%. Whereas what has happened is ZANU has created this impression, whether these figures are manufactured or they are real. Martin Dina was elected just 2 or 3 weeks ago with a threshold of close to 12,600 votes. And this is an increase from the threshold of votes in the same constituency before for ZANU-PF. So in a sense, ZANU-PF is a creature of power. It is focused on telling a credible story about how it is likely to win 2018. The more the opposition focus on all other side shows, ZANU-PF is focusing on power. So in every constituency that the opposition has boycotted, even the urban one, the ZANU-PF winning margin has not been the 3,000 or 2,000 that they got historically when those were contested constituents. It has been a much higher threshold. And I have kept on asking, are we not being sent into a choreographed dance in the 2018 election? Firstly, we have seen court judgments that essentially make you think that the courts are very impartial, because ZANU-PF are being convicted in the courts, some who are serving legislators. In a sense, for anyone to then wake up and say the Zimbabwean courts are partial, it will be difficult to make that case. And equally so, for you to wake up and say ZANU-PF does not have support, when they've recorded in primaries a significant voter turnout in their favor, would equally be problematic, especially to an external audience. And this is all choreographed for an external audience. And my sense is that we do need the visionaries within the opposition who concentrate on big rallies and mass mobilizations, but we do need the nuts and bolts people who focus on strategy, on the minutiae detail of how to turn a supporter into a voter. At the moment, I'm not seeing that. And the palpable arrogance within the opposition is each time someone questions, they dismiss the questioning as either academic or they say you are a diaspora hamburger eater who does not know the practicalities of the local struggle.
But Brian, speaking about visionaries, William Umuchai, a political analyst, actually wrote something quite interesting a couple of years ago. He said that Zimbabwe is not short of political parties, but has a severe drought of visionaries, like you've just pointed out. He says who can actually move the boat in the right direction. But some even go further and say people like you yourself could have done much more, but seem to have abandoned ship. How do you respond to this?
I live 50% in Zimbabwe. I keep hearing this nonsense of abandoning ship. I live 50% in Zimbabwe and 50% in Johannesburg, and this is purely because I run a private business. I don't work for anyone. I work for myself. And for the 50% that I am in my home country, I do a lot. I do a lot privately. I may not be in the press as much, but I do quite a lot to contribute to the democratization of the country. My sense is the issue at the moment is I don't think we have the luxury of saying let's replace the cast of opposition top leaders that we have. I mean, we have 18 months, and in 18 months we're not going to be able to do that. But we are able to put together winning teams. These are winning teams that focus on the technical aspects, the think tanks, and so on and so forth. My sense is that we have concentrated too much on shaming and naming the regime for all its ills and forgotten that the morning after the regime has left, there's a country to govern, an economy to run. And unless if we're clear about what that process of turning around the ship is, we're going to have a lot of empty rhetoric and vision and concentrate only on the conquest of power and forget that the citizen discontent is not just about an individual or an institution. It is about failed policy and failed
We'll talk about the economy later, but there's this talk of creating a transitional authority, and you have been associated with it, or the articles that have been published about this has listed a group of people, of concerned Zimbabweans, who are said to be talking about this. Some of the names that have been touted are people like Ibo Mandaza, Trevor Ngube, Judith Todd. Can you tell us what you know about this?
Okay, I've not had the privilege of participating in the NTA discussion. I was invited. I have seen the documentation. It's not a new idea. You will recall that the Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition during my time and Brian Raftopoulos had proposed a transitional authority at the time when we thought the country was in crisis, around 2005, 2004. CPI, which did the Great Zimbabwe Scenarios, also proposed a transitional authority ahead of the GNU. So the idea itself is old, and my understanding is very simple. You do not have consensus across the political divide. The primary focus of political actors is on the transfer of political power through an electoral process. At the rate at which we're going, that's likely to be a fairly bloody and violent affair. In the meanwhile, the prolonged political bloodletting is not going to be kind on the economy. The economy is bleeding. If we, 20 months ahead of an election or 19 months ahead of an election, we have police officers not paid, soldiers not paid, CIO not paid, civil servants not paid, ordinary vendors and cross-border traders not able to do their trade. We've created a severe humanitarian crisis that will make the election a highly emotive and polemical affair. So the notion is, you do need a cooling off period. And that cooling off period may be necessitated by several factors. An early step down by Mugabe or an escalation of the sort of economic crisis and the political tensions we're seeing in the country. And this requires that an expert group of people, representative, technically competent, help to stabilize things and steer the economy in the right direction.
But who would the players? Who would pick the players? Would this be a self-selection?
I mean, there's several ways. The various ways in which the NTA is done is by expertise or by designation by parties. You know, parties do nominate folk for various commissions and so on and so forth. Look, is this nothing is a likelihood in a country, and so I know a lot of people are critical of this idea as they are critical of many other ideas. Electoral reform depends on Mugabe making the necessary concessions that the constitutional provisions requiring reform must be adhered to. NTA requires the sort of concessions across the political divide that this would be necessary. In any event, the issue is that the country needs much more than one solution. The tragedy of our previous engagement is we've gone to the table with only one solution, and when that solution fails, we don't have a plan B or a plan C.
But how would you try to entice the opposition political parties who've rejected this, and also how can this be successful without ZANU-PF, who also said no to this because of what happened with the GNU?
I'm actually surprised by that question, Violet. You know, the Constitutional Reform Corps, which we initiated, Tawanda Mtasa, Depros Mchena, myself, Eva Joyce Wynne, Priscilla Mshonga, Welshman Tendai BT, and a few of us, we were nobodies. And when we first put this idea on the table, we were dismissed as idealistic. In fact, some of our mentors told us that there was no way that the idea of constitutional reform would see the day. This was our conversation in 1997. Barely 2 years later, in 1998, not only was ZANU-PF now discussing, and it had rejected outrightly, and ZANU-PF was more hegemonic then, the idea of constitutional reform. In 1998, as you know, we were not only discussing constitutional reform, but we're moving towards the Constitutional Commission and the counter-NCA position. The currency of ideas is not dependent on the acquiescence of political parties. It's dependent on what citizens think is the right for them. We have had an anomaly in Zimbabwe where we have mortgaged the future of the country to political parties. The future of the country remains in the hands of citizens, and if there's a disagreement between political parties and the citizen always wins. The legitimacy of a political party is not in the fact that it exists. The legitimacy of a political party is its ability to epitomize recognize what we as citizens demand, desire, and want. And at the moment, Zimbabwean citizens want a solution to their daily misery, not to elect another dictator, not to have anybody who thinks they're entitled to leadership because they have suffered. This is a make or break time for our nation, and I think that we need much more than one idea on the table to discuss. And we're not seeking for permission. As citizens, we're entitled to determine the course of our own destiny.
So who will provide the resources for this NTA?
Well, let's cross that bridge when we come to it. As I said, it is an idea that was discussed in my absence. The documents have been shared with me, and I'll be happy, because I'll be happy, despite my earlier criticism, I'll be happy to participate in the future discussion. All I'm refusing is we say one idea is more practical than the other. If you had asked me when we were proposing that Morgan Tsvangirai should even be considered as a leader of our country, people would have told you 1997-98, it was totally impractical, right? They would have told you it doesn't have the qualification, it doesn't have the national stature. Now that question is not on the table anymore. Everything that I have done, my generation has done in the pro-democracy movement in our country has been based on this idealism that says citizens are free and entitled to choose, one, their leadership, two, the ideas about development, and three, the institutions that will shape that development.
Right, so basically you're saying any pressure is good pressure. Pressure should not only come from the political parties but also from the citizens, and it may also come through this NTA, this initiative.
Yes, I mean, look at the ridiculous thing happening in the United States of America. Donald Trump thought he had very clear ideas about immigration, and now he's had to deal with citizens that are conscious and that have demands. Let the opposition political parties and whoever else know that citizens are not guinea pigs. We don't just chew what a political party tells us, especially if you're asking for votes in 2018.
But it has been said also by critics of the NTA that the country would really, there has to be civil unrest or real violence in the country for such a platform like the NTA to be put forward, and also for the outside world, the international community to intervene or to come and help. Do you agree with that? That the time is ripe enough for an NTA?
No, that's lazy analysis. That's very lazy. It's the laziest analysis I've ever had. Look, every political power and actor within our country knows their weaknesses, whether they admit them in the media or they don't. Everybody knows what ZANU is incapable of doing or marshalling now. The bravado, they can make all sorts of claims. Everybody knows what the opposition is incapable of doing now. The idea has not been fully fleshed out, this NTA idea. So when you start criticizing and tearing to thread an idea that is still in evolution, it just shows an immaturity. The people have simply said, perhaps we need a transitional authority, because if you don't have electoral reforms within the next 6 months, it's pointless doing electoral reforms with less than 8 months of campaigning to go, because the institutions won't have taken root, and because the processes and mechanisms, if you look at how long it takes us to set up a commission, to get the personnel, to get the internal procedure, and so on and so forth. So you ask yourself, if the route or the route of electoral reforms is this late in the day, and we have an impending election which the opposition is threatening to boycott in the absence of reform, what do we do? Capitulate to an uncontested Robert Mugabe election in 2018? So a few people are asking the question, should we rather have another alternative on the table? Now, that alternative may morph into different things, as did the first NTA proposal moved into a GNU. Now, although it was facilitated by Mbeki in the discussion, it was not Mbeki's decision. It was the decision of the critical political actors at the time. And so it's useful for people not to, in my view, I suspect that our people have a politically monogamous approach to idea, that only one idea is right. There are many potential solutions to the crisis we face in our country. And unfortunately, if we don't think about the various possibilities, we'll be caught napping again, especially the academics and civil society. When many of us were saying a negotiation was impending in 2008, 2009, you remember, we were very few of us who were saying that negotiation is going to lead into a GNU, because a lot of the people in civil society and our super analysts did not see through the wood that these are political actors who are concerned about retaining political power, and they will negotiate based on what they see as the best possible option, what they would like to get out of power.
And Brian, you have always said the ZANU-PF's biggest opposition is the economy. Do you still believe that, given the growing civil unrest?
Yeah. Look, civil unrest is a very interesting thing. I've engaged in it myself. It dissipates with time, right? Even when sustained, like the University of Zimbabwe unrest, which lasted for 4 years, or so on and so forth. At some stage, as it becomes a little bit more violent, what you are likely to have is the church-type folks who are pacifist by nature are going to dissociate themselves with the violent incarnation of civil unrest. Whether this violent incarnation is by the organizers of the civil unrest or by agents provocateurs planted by the state, it really doesn't matter, right? So, in a sense, what literally happens is that this moment must be celebrated and enjoyed as citizens, remembering that they've always stood up. They stood up against colonialism. They stood up against the corruption in ZANU-PF in the late 80s. They stood up against ESAP in the 90s. They stood up against what was a growing dictatorship in the late 90s into the constitutional moment. And they're standing up against economic emasculation now. So my sense is that is not the real opposition. The people who are demonstrating because there are some regulations they don't like, if those regulations are removed, they're going to go back to their daily trade, right? The people who are demonstrating because they've not been paid, if they receive their salaries, they're going to withdraw from what we're seeing as a critical mass. What's going to remain is a fringe radical core that is conscious about the broader structural issue. So my sense is, what is that thing that will mobilize all constituencies, whether or not each has received a little dose of what they wanted? And I think it is the economy. And let me tell you why I think it is the economy. There's simply no significant prospect for anyone who's running a business, medium scale, small scale, or big in our country. The costs of production are too high. The ability to compete with the regional players, let alone international players, is minuscule. The punitive nature of our taxation system is such that to survive as a business person is beyond the threshold even of genius in our country. And that's one. Then you have the ordinary person who does not who doesn't run a business. The ordinary person who says, look, all I want to do is to live each day, have enough energy to work and to earn a living for my family. What we've made is we've made it impossible for that ordinary person. Then, of course, we have those who don't work, don't have jobs, who went to school, who are looking for prospects to be employed. We've made it impossible even for them to self-employ, let alone get anything to live off. So what we've done, what the economy does, is it cascades or generates and cascades anger across the different social classes in our society. And it sustains them. Because each time these young people see a minister driving a Mercedes-Benz, making false promises about this and that, they see their poverty as the antithesis of this, if you like, obscene accumulation amongst the political elite.
So, Brian, if the economy is ZANU-PF's biggest opposition, how much time do we have as a country?
If we don't get any relief, we do not have 180 days. If nothing gives, because if we don't get any international bailout package, we don't get a huge investor that can, because at the moment we are basically getting money, creating new debt. And we're creating that debt. Deprosson a couple of years ago estimated that every unborn Zimbabwean already owed in the region of, I think he said 400,000. By way of interest and capital, right? Now, when you add our domestic and external debt stock together, every single one of us is a debtor. But we are not indebted on the basis of money that was borrowed to build value or infrastructure in our country. Our debt is for money that is financing consumption and financing the purchase of tear gas and the military machinery.
On that issue, and just briefly, others would then say because of the financial problems, ZANU-PF does not have the resources to mount a sustained law order initiative to block the social unrest. So what is the end game for ZANU-PF?
I don't. You know what keeps it capable to mount a law and order is not tear gas availability, is the fear amongst those who ordinarily would be the allies of the citizens, arising out of the lack of clarity of what is our position on them. We are clear on our position on them, jurors and so on and so forth. But I don't hear what the position is on the police and other actors, except rhetorical one-liners. So what's going to happen, a collective fear is what keeps them together. And don't forget that a significant portion of our law enforcement are former border Gezi, green bomber entities. And they are motivated not by the same motivation that the ordinary law enforcement officer would be. So they are party apparatchiks who are engaged in some pseudo law enforcement bit. I think the end game is one that must be precipitated by a reference to the economy. My sense is ZANU-PF can limp on towards the next election. As it limps on towards the next election, it has to try and smear the opposition, right? Cause all sorts of divisions. And that's not difficult looking at how poorly structured the coalition is.
So, and finally, Brian, what advice can you give to the citizens of Zimbabwe?
I think for once, beyond being clear about why Mugabe must go, we need to be clear about what our future must look like. I don't think we'll have the luxury the day after we put in another leader to start talking about our common future. We have already seen semblances of dictatorial tendencies within these leaders' own political parties. So my sense is, my advice is that let's have a citizens' manifesto. We don't need political parties to facilitate a citizens' manifesto. And I've been saying for the last 3 years, I've been saying to everybody I meet, have them from the district to the constituency to the provincial level, so that each district and constituency and province has a citizens' manifesto. In this constituency, in this province, in this district, this is what we, the citizens, want. And any political party that comes must negotiate with the citizens around their manifesto. That is the citizens' manifesto. So that if a political party's manifesto is not aligned to the citizens' manifesto, it's rejected out of hand. I think that the time when we waited for political parties to bring us solutions like our old parents would bring us sweets from Aranel is over. Citizens must realize that the destiny of our nation can no longer be mortgaged or sublet, not to outsiders and not to political actors who are interested only in power.
Thank you very much, Brian Kagoro. Thank you for speaking to us on the program Hot Seat.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Raz. You're welcome.
Bye.
You've been listening to the program Hot Seat with Violet Gonda.